Hi, everybody. This is Lauren Baker, founder of Search Engine Journal, and thank you for attending today's Search Engine Journal SEJ webinar with our partners at Conductor. Today, we have a special webinar all about migrations to the point where we have Cody Galt, the Migration Services Lead at Conductor. Cody, how's it going?
I'm good. How are you today?
Pretty good, thank you. The fact that you have migration in your title means that you know what you're talking about. So everyone, if you have a site migration in the plans, you're working on something, whether it's a total URL change, whether it's a platform change, or whether you're just looking at changing through a rebrand, there's going to be all kinds of great information here for you today, things to keep an eye out for, and things not to do as well. But before we get started with Cody's presentation, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping to answer some questions which may come up during the presentation and give all of you an idea of what to expect. So first thing, the presentation should last around 25 to 30 minutes. We're going to be launching 2 polls during the presentation as well. Please answer the poll questions to the best of your ability. That helps, not only helps Cody know basically the audience that is participating in the event today, but also we can craft our questions and answers and conversation around your expertise and experience as well. So that's really important on that side. Also, the official hashtag is hashtag SEJwebinar. Feel free to share that with all of your friends and take pictures and screen caps to share on Twitter and let everyone know what they're missing out on. The most popular questions that we do get are, 1, will this webinar be made available afterwards? The answer is yes. So we will be sending out a recap to all registrants with video of the webinar along with slides. That way you can share the great information that you've learned today with others within your company. And then also the video will be made available on YouTube and the Search Engine Journal channel and the recap. So we'll have all of that together for you. I think that takes care of most of the housekeeping. We will be doing Q&A after Cody's presentation, along, like I said, with launching polls. If you do have questions that come up during the slides, please enter them into the question box. We'll be preparing those questions during the Q&A, and if anything is specifically timely, we'll be addressing them during the slides as well. So Cody, I'm going to hand things off to you, let you get started on this. I'm really excited about sitting through it, and as I'm sure most of our attendees are as well.
All right, sounds good. Okay, well, so my name is Cody Galt. I am the Migration Services Lead at Conductor. I was actually hired to make this service and streamline it and everything. So really, for my experience and background, I've done SEO for about 10 years. Doing some different things way back when, maybe getting in a little trouble, and then now just doing regular SEO. For the most part, for the last 4 years, all I've done is migrations. A few audits here and there, but it's literally just migration. So with that in mind, I get to see a lot of stuff, and I get to be stressed out all the time. So let's get on into it. So frankly, nobody likes migrations. A lot of people feel that migrations are scary. I don't disagree there. It's not my favorite thing either when you're doing it. And that's just because, there's a lot of risk involved, right? If you screw up, you're going to lose your traffic. That can impact revenue. It's not something you want. So in general, when talking with people, that's a lot of what comes up is, hey, there is some fear there. There's some trepidation when you're going on into a migration, right? It's scary. So the interesting thing is, since we talk to a lot of people, we do quite a few, migrations already. One thing we see just in the answers that we get are, for one, the majority of teams we've worked with, they don't really have any experience with migration. We'll get, a few teams here or there that have a little bit of experience going on, but for the most part, nobody's really done it. The other thing that we see is that roughly half the migrations are involving some form of JavaScript framework. They're moving to something that's built off of Angular, that's built off of React. When you don't have experience with migrations and you got JavaScript frameworks coming up, not necessarily the funnest thing in the world. Another thing we see is nearly everyone's worried about losing rankings and traffic, but there really isn't a full plan in place to mitigate that risk. So a lot of times when they're coming to us, that's one of the things that they're, that they're worried about. They want to make sure that, hey, everything goes smoothly. And then lastly, a lot of migrations are around the 4 to 6 month mark. I'd say that's the average of what we see. And that does leave teams feeling a little bit rushed there. You're already stressed out with doing it. So when you don't have enough time, it's just one of those things, nobody feels good. And you don't necessarily know if that migration is going to be pushed back anyway. So you kind of feel, the clock's running out and you got to get this stuff taken care of. Oh, look, I organized. Okay, moving on. So where do we see the majority of migration issues? Well, usually comes up with technical SEO problems. Think pretty standard. Content changes when a migration is happening, also kind of a pretty big deal that we see. A lack of action and focus. You'd be surprised at how often things are slow to move. There may be a lot of people, but with all those people, sometimes no one's really focusing on things. We see rush projects. While I said 4 to 6 months is kind of the average, we sometimes see migrations that are like 1 to 3 months. And it's not something I like to see. I don't think anybody likes dealing with that amount of time where it's like, oh, we're going to do this. All right, let's go. And then a lack of communication. When you're dealing with a lot of team members, sometimes those internal team members for a client, or if you're at the company and you're handling it, a lack of communication does actually provide a big issue there that sometimes messes with things. So with that in mind, we've got a few things just to look at. So we're going to first cover technical issues, right? We said technical SEO problems are one of the things that we see often. So I want to jump into a few items that come up and don't seem to really be talked about. There's a lot of good checklists out there, things to look at, really good stuff. But these are some of the issues that we're seeing just in the last few years of dealing with, and we wanted to let you know so that we could take care of it. So we've got JavaScript issues first up. So the first thing I want to say is, hey, if you're working with a framework, Angular or React, don't launch without a form of pre-rendering, right? The worst damage we see for clients when they're launching with a JavaScript framework is when they rely on Google to render that content. Now, you might have seen a couple of days ago, I think Martin Split said, hey, yeah, we render stuff now at like 5 minutes. If that's fully true, great. I have seen some fast rendering times, but I've also seen cases where Google maybe doesn't render all of the content, it only renders a portion of the content. So if you're relying on, Google to do all the heavy lifting for you, I really don't recommend it, right? To me, it's just going to lead to a bad time. You want to go and tell Google, hey, this is the content that I want to make sure that you see. So, if you're doing pre-rendering, dynamic serving, anything like that, you want to make sure that Google's actually getting that content. Don't trust them to actually read everything, because odds are they're probably going to miss some stuff. Along with JavaScript, something that we see kind of, a little bit is JavaScript links. So that's something that really we just don't like to see, because oftentimes they're not used, I would say, in the right way. So the thing to keep in mind with JavaScript links, your like on-click elements and stuff like that, where there's no Ahref tag or anything like that. Google doesn't crawl them, right? They don't see that. And so if you're relying on that for your internal linking structure, it doesn't work out well whatsoever. So with that in mind, you want to be sure that those links are seen by Google. You're not relying on that. Those are crawlable. And then also with JavaScript, you don't want to hide your content behind any user interaction. So if you've got, hey, we've got these tabs and you got to click on them and then the content gets loaded in and we think it's a great user experience. The problem is, again, Google can't see it. And if they can't see it and read it, they can't rank it. So you want to make sure that any content, like we said, pre-rendering and all that, if there's content that you want to rank and you want Google to see it and capture it, don't hide it. Don't hide it behind any JavaScript interaction, whether it's a link to get to that page, whether it's some form of interaction in a tab. You don't want to do it. So again, JavaScript issues, kind of a big deal that we're seeing. These are, I think, right here, the things that we see most often as potential issues when it comes up. So if you can tackle these, you're going to be in a good spot. All right, from JavaScript links to internal linking. So, we did mention JavaScript links can mess with a little bit of internal linking because, Google can't see it. So that leads kind of one of the other big problems we see at times. Don't drastically change your internal linking structure if you can help it. Look, you're going through a migration, so odds are lots of things are changing. Hopefully you have a say in what changes, but you may not. So while changes are likely to happen, you need to be aware of, your previous linking. How are things going? How are they set up before you did the change? The reason is we sometimes see that if you bury those links, if you take them like, hey, we had some category pages and they're linked directly off the home page, and we move them, a few layers deep, so you can't find them in the menu anymore. You got to go through this, convoluted mess to get there. It's not going to end well. It's one of those things that we see really sometimes harm a site because that internal link equity that you've built and that you're working with, when you're drastically changing that, you may forget about some pages. You may miss some pages. I'd also say, while JavaScript seems like the bigger issue at hand, it is a big issue. I think internal linking sometimes really slips under the radar and just gets left behind, doesn't really get thought about at times. So again, that's an area to really focus on. Keep in mind what you had beforehand, because if you remember what you did, you may be able to save yourself a headache later on by, potentially reverting to that. And then with internal links, one thing we see a bit too often lately, it feels like, is internal linking and how it relates to just your menu. So your menu links matter. I know sometimes people think that it's in the menu, maybe it doesn't matter as much. They may reference the surfer patent that Google had that was talked about a while ago. But what I've seen over the years from doing migrations and just being in SEO in general is that your menu navigation is a strong signal to Google about what's important to you and what pages are important. And sometimes what I've seen is where pages in the menu are getting pulled out, either, page maybe just they don't really care about it as much, or it just didn't get linked, or maybe it's in JavaScript links. And almost always, I'd say every single time I've seen it, we've seen issues of traffic drops, ranking loss, directly related to the page that's pulled out. So with your menus, keep an eye on what did I have before the migration and what are you moving to? If you can avoid drastically changing it, I really recommend just avoiding it. I get that you may have to sometimes, but we want to do everything we can to mitigate risk. And part of that is just, remembering kind of how things were set up beforehand.
Hey, Cody, we had a question come in about content accordions. So accordions not only with like the page level, I guess, rich content on the page side, but then also like with FAQ markup and page level FAQs becoming so popular in the past couple of years. Would you say that accordions are something that should really be looked at before page migration, going from one style to another, or the ability to maybe, if that content is being crawled or not, open that content up to Google with a new migration, or any thoughts on that side?
Yeah, definitely. So if you can open it up before you're doing the migration, I recommend it. Mostly because, for one, there's usually going to be a period of time in that between when we're launching, when it actually launches. So if you can look at that and identify, is this content being indexed, and real quick, throw it in the URL inspection tool, check the index code, and search through there. If it's being indexed, okay, it's good. You can keep it how it is. If it's not being indexed and they don't see it, I do recommend changing that before the migration. If you've got we got 2 months, we got 3 months before we launch, do it. That'll allow you to see kind of how Google's reacting already. You may get some bumps from it crawling that content. And I think it's worth pursuing at that time. And also, I will say, I'm not against any accordions or anything like that with tab content. You just got to make sure it's indexed. So if you have the time to open it up before you migrate, go for it. But if you're thinking of opening it up maybe a couple days beforehand, I don't know that I would do it personally.
Okay, great, great. That's really good to know. And then before you get moving, I have another question that came in that's fairly relevant as well.
Mhm.
You said try not to change the internal linking structure, but when there's a domain change involved, will maintaining the same architecture be sufficient to limit that risk? So for example, if we went from searchenginejournal.com to sej.com as a domain migration, would you recommend that we keep the same internal architecture slash category slash post name, et cetera, the same? And or double checking on, I guess, coding shortcuts that don't have the domain, but just assume that the file
Mhm.
subfolder is the same on each page. You have any recommendations on that side? It was asked in the questions as well.
Yeah, so we've done a few like that, just straight up changes where that it was literally pretty much find and replace on the domain name side of things. The structure stayed the same. When we've done that, we've seen the site's been pretty good, pretty stable in how traffic went after the fact. So if your structure is good, I do recommend just keeping it as is. Don't fix what isn't broke, right? So if you can keep it, I'd recommend that. But if you have a bad structure in place and there's something that's just not great, you can change it, right? I do want to, like, I'm not against those changes, but if you can go to something better, you can. You just kind of want to be aware. And where I've seen in the past it go wrong is just massive changes, right? Sometimes they've completely renamed things at the same time. They've buried things. They've um, merged things together. So you got to keep that in mind. But if you're just going from domain A to domain B, and you want to leave that structure in place, yeah, that's fine. With just domain changes, I find those to be the simplest migrations, frankly. And in the past, we've had probably the least fluctuation with that, where things either really don't change at all or they change on a minor scale. And then the second part, which was you said, like with short codes and checking those, right? If if you have them, yeah, I would just double check to make sure that those actually all work. Especially if you've got images and you're moving on over and you've got all your images in your WordPress folder and it's from 2015 and you change that and it's 2021 and now everything's broken. I'd check into that.
Awesome. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, so just talked about some JavaScript issues, talked about some internal linking issues right there. It's great to talk, but I actually do have something to show you that we experienced. A lot of people like to talk about migration successes. I love talking about those, but sometimes things just go wrong. So you see this chart here and everything. Let's go. Let's open it up and let me see if my red bar came up. So what you're seeing here, that red bar right in the middle there, that's the day that they launched. So you got 3 months before, the month of launch, 3 months after. So if you're looking here, you can see, hey, good amount of top 3 keywords, good 4 through 10, some good stuff right there. And then after the launch, it's losing, what is that, almost 2,000, and then it just goes down a couple months. There's a good shift in movement there, right? So what went wrong in this case? Well, this was a case where there were JavaScript links that were being used. There was content hidden behind JavaScript on top of that. And then there was a lot of internal linking changes, specifically with the menu. So pretty much everything I just talked about all led to this wonderful perfect storm. What happened is the site, launched. These were major issues. They weren't taken care of. And Google couldn't really crawl. I mean, there were still links on you'd find links to categories and stuff like that, but it just went wrong, right? You don't want to do a migration and lose 2,000 of your top 3 keywords. Traffic-wise, it's not good. So that's why it's important, right, to look at those things. If you see things that are going wrong or you're not sure, like, speak out against it. If you're thinking, hey, I just want to do like all this stuff, maybe, pump the brakes a little, double check. And when you're working with developers who love JavaScript, JavaScript can be great, right? It's got a lot of functionality. It can be pretty decent, but you gotta watch out for those things. So yeah, if you're dealing with this, be aware. Sometimes things go wrong, and then recovery is kind of a pain afterwards. With that being said, right, it's technical SEO. There may be some things like, well, it feels like you forgot this. I do have some things that I call my launch day critical issues that I look at, right? These are things that you don't want to get wrong. So the day that you launch, check your no index tags. I can't tell you how many times I see no index tags just manage to show up on the live site on the day of launch. Check your redirects. Make sure that they actually got uploaded and that they're running. Check that first thing, have it ready to go so launch happens and you crawl, and be aware if something broke. And we're going to talk about that aspect a little bit later on too. We'll get back to redirect. Check your robots.txt. I have seen a developer block everybody from crawling the website, and so you launch and now Google can't get through. So check that day of, the minute of. You never know if staging's robots.txt just got ported over. It happens. Check your canonical tags. One of the funniest things I've seen in the past, it's not really funny, but all the canonical URLs were the staging URLs. Everything else moved over, yep, but staging was still canonical. Yeah. Thankfully, I don't see it too often, but when I did, it was a nice double take there. So double check them. And, keep in mind too, right, you're going from domain A to domain B potentially. Make sure that old domain isn't in there. I haven't seen that one yet, but it could happen. So do check those. And then lastly, on launch day critical issues, rollbacks are not your friend, and they do bring problems. I have seen problems where redirects were put in and a rollback happened and the redirect file didn't make it over when they relaunched. So if a rollback happens, pretty much everything on this list that you checked, go check it again, because the last thing you want is, oh, well, we broke this functionality, we roll it back, we launch an hour later, and you just assume that everything's good. So be aware of those things for launch day critical issues. So we're going to go to our first poll question, which is, how worried are you about technical issues during the migration? And I'll throw the answers up. Lauren?
Okay, great. I'm launching this right now. So here we go. Like Cody said, how worried about you about technical issues during a migration? Not worried at all, no problem. Slightly worried, moderately worried, or if you're like me, very worried. So please, if everyone could just answer, we have about 60%. How worried are you about technical issues during a migration? Not worried, slightly worried, moderately worried, very worried. Cody, thank you for bringing up the no index issue. I see that all the time, not just with migrations, but just updates and releases going from staging to live or staging to production. Same thing with canonicals, and then also the confusion between the no follow, or the disallow and the no index. So very many times I see where developers or SEOs want a page to be no index, but then they disallow that, so Google cannot read the no index command if you disallow it in the robots.txt. So it looks like we have 73% of you have voted. I'm gonna go ahead and close this poll. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Closing now and sharing the results. So moderately worried came in at 40%. Very worried at 31%. Slightly 26%, and then only 2% of attendees today are not worried at all. So about 6 or 7 of you just are like, oh, I'm fine. No problem whatsoever. Going to sleep well through the night. Right, the night before the migration, and ready to go. So hiding the results. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, for those 2% that are not worried, that's good to hear. Good luck with it. And too, one thing I will say, sometimes depending if you're doing a simple migration, not a lot's changing. Your framework's not changing. Yeah, technical issues aren't really something you're going to have to worry about, which is good. But most of the time, we see that it's platform changes and stuff like that. So yeah, I'm not surprised. That's good to know, though. That's a good alignment right there. All right, so let's jump forward here. We covered technical issues. That was more the brunt of things. Now we're getting into some content issues and we'll just go through it. So, mention content. Here's things to be aware of. If you can help it, don't change your content during a migration. So what I mean is, hey, we're migrating. We're going to change all our old content into new content when we migrate. So now on the new site, it's completely fresh. The reason you don't want to do this, changing your content is removing a formerly stable element of your site. You knew how Google viewed your old content. Now you have new content while undergoing a migration, and Google's reevaluating the new site with structure changes and all that, and they're reevaluating the content. And that's the problem, because now if you've done that and something goes wrong, you now have to figure out, well, what went wrong? And usually for us, changing content, we've seen some bad stuff happen with that. And in general, I just recommend, if you can help it, don't change your content during the migration, if possible. Or, title tags, meta descriptions, fine, go for it. H1 tag, sure. But the brunt of your content should stay the same. Otherwise, you just have another thing to look at that potentially could be wrong. So make sure that you back that content up if you do that. Which is right here. Yeah, if you change it up, back it up. Hey, use Web Archive if you want to take snapshots. If you save it to a Word doc, that's fine also. If something goes wrong and you can identify that it's the content, reverting that content can be a key factor in that migration recovery. We've seen reverted content go and revert pretty much all traffic loss after a migration, just going back to something that was better. So if you've got to change it, hold off until things kind of stabilize. I get sometimes that's not an option, but if you can make the argument, do it. Hold off on the content change, wait a couple of weeks, and then do it so you can see how Google's viewing it. All right, redirects. They're in the content section, right? Kind of a surprise, but you want to make sure that you're properly targeting redirects. Don't mass redirect to the home page. We've seen it happen. You've probably all heard of it happening or worked on a client after a migration happened where it did happen. If a page is missing, then, find a suitable match for it. Don't send it to the home page. If it's a product page that's, well, the product's gone, well, send it back to the product category. Sure, Google may view it as a soft 404. They may, remove that equity, but there's a better chance of it passing on if it's a close match than to just a generic homepage. So always make sure that you're doing the best you can, one-to-one if possible, or to the closest match. And then if an important page has no match, consider recreating the page. We've seen that a couple of times where it's just like, hey, these are important things and you just don't have them. It's like, yeah, they just don't. It's like, well, these have a lot of rankings. There's a lot of traffic here and there's no real match. You should recreate that if it fits within the brand or whatever, because you don't want to lose that. So that is something to consider there with redirects. So point them to the right place. Don't mass redirect to the home page, and consider recreating pages if you need to. With that said, right, we got another failure to show you of what happened. So what happened in this case? Rankings aren't as large as the last time with 30,000, but there is a big drop. 780, 760 average on the top 3, day of launch 750 to 460. You even see top 4 through 10 dropping. Really just not good. So what happened here? Well, there was massive content changes before they put it in as the migration happened. Not only that, there was content removal. Some pages were completely gone, all their content torched, others were merged in, and it just was kind of clunky. Then you had internal linking changes going on as well. There's some international components there. There's some other stuff going on. And then there was a phased launch leading up to it. And that also led to some issues because, again, the multiple sites, international component. So there's a lot going on here. But here's the results, right? It's not a good thing to see. I mean, losing pretty much close to half of your keywords in the second month. So that's why I say, hey, and that's one of the first questions we ask: are you doing content changes? If they say yes, I tell them we recommend you can wait. We recommend double checking your content, because it can be pretty bad. So with content, right? Those are the main things we see with content. It comes up a little too often. I don't see it talked about all the time. So be aware of what you're removing and what you're changing when you're undergoing the migration.
Just real quick, I wanted,
mm-hmm.
oh, sorry, real quick, I wanted to say thank you for bringing up the internationalization component of all of this as well, especially if someone is working on separate domains and separate TLDs per country, like .com, .co.uk, .jp, etc. Because essentially, if they're all set up with hrefs, or sorry, not hreflang, then if that's all not coordinated upon the relaunch, even if one of those is relaunched, it's going to break everything, right? So, for example, if your hreflang tag for US, right, refers back to .co.uk, that's reciprocated, .co.jp reciprocated, and you change your .com, that's going to lead to basically redirects from all of the different sites that you're associated as part of that web. So it's probably a different webinar, but thanks for bringing that up because I've seen that happen multiple times, where not only if as a result of the bad migration is your .com or being negatively affected, but then you negatively affect your whole internationalization plan as well. So yes, thank you.
That right there, that's what happened. Maybe Germany changed all their content and the US didn't, and then there was a mismatch, and it didn't go well. So good thing to keep in mind. So with that in mind, with content out of the way, our next poll question, which was just how worried are you about content issues during the migration? And I'll throw up those answers right there. All right.
Amazing. So let's launch the second poll. Like Cody said, how worried about you about content issues during migration? Same answers as last time. Not worried, slightly worried, moderately worried, or very worried. So it looks like a lot of you have already voted. I'm going to do this fairly quickly. We're at 60%. Let's try to get 70% again. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. This is your final chance, and I am closing the poll at 70%. Sharing the results. So it looks like we have a little bit more people that are not worried than the original at 8%, but 35% slightly worried, 34% moderately worried, 23% very worried, and then 8% not worried. So it looks like more folks are a bit more worried about changes on the technical side during a site migration, but not necessarily as much on the content side. It's a little bit more even in terms of people that are worried, and a lot more are not losing any sleep the night before as well. Any thoughts there?
I mean, it makes sense, right? I'd say most of the migrations that I do, thankfully, the content really isn't changing a whole lot, maybe some minor tweaks here or there. So this kind of falls in line, right? Most migrations have more technical issues coming up than anything. So if your content's not really changing, the biggest fear you're going to have is that, your redirects are pointed in the right place content-wise. Otherwise, I can see it being, a little bit less there, a little bit more even keel. All righty. All right, so some migration tips here. Looks like we have. So, we covered technical issues, covered content issues, some things maybe not as aware of, just some things we see, but I did have some tips, some things to, be aware of as well. So communication, right? I mentioned lack of communication was a problem that we see. So don't bring your developers in late to a migration. This is where communication, there's the breakdown that I usually see involves developers. We have found that the later developers are brought in, the more likely that the technical issues that you have will persist through the launch. If you bring your developers in a month beforehand, there's not a lot of time to fix things. So we recommend have open communication with them, get them into the process early, and they even may be involved in the process of the migration, but they're probably not thinking necessarily about anything related to SEO. So you want to be talking to them as soon as you can, as soon as you find things. With that, you want to test early so that the developers have time to fix those issues. If you tell them a week before launch that, oh, there's this major issue, they're really not going to like you. So be talking, prioritize things. be respectful of their time. They're dealing with this project. Developers are dealing with a lot more than we are on the migration front. There's a lot more moving pieces that we're probably not even aware of that they have to deal with. So be respectful of their time, and that's just in part of communication and bringing them in early, and then properly prioritize your issues so that they know what has to be fixed before a migration launches and what can wait. Because if they have that, they're going to be doing much better on their end. They'll know, like, okay, I just have to fix these 2 things and these 5 things can wait. And then again, address issues early. So we mentioned that with the developers, but you want to address them early in the process just in general. The sooner you identify and address problems, things like, taxonomy, URL structure, you want to get those in real early. If you notice something wrong, the better off you'll be. You won't be rushing. You'll have time to fix things. You can breathe easy because, okay, it's not a week before launch and we're trying to fix things. And also, don't expect an issue to be taken care of after you mention it. You got to follow up on it. I've had that issue come up time and time again where it's like, you just tell someone, hey, this is really critical to fix. Okay, it'll be fixed. You check a couple days later, it's not fixed. So keep following up on these things. Make sure that, things aren't getting, going under the rug and you're like, well, so-and-so said they'd do it, so I'm just going to assume it's done. No, double check, be in communication. Oh, migration tips again. I guess I screwed up my slide. Oh, well, that would be general issues then. Okay, so real migration tips. The more you change, the harder it is to diagnose what caused the drop. We said that about content before, so that's why if you can hold out on certain changes, you can piecemeal it after launch. It's going to be way easier to identify any specific issues. We have seen sometimes, and you're looking, well, there's some technical issues, but then there's these issues, what caused it. Again, content may be why something fell through. Maybe it's internal linking. But the more items you add, the harder it is to actually figure out what went wrong. So if you can, curtail some changes till later on, I recommend doing it. It'll make diagnosing any issues way easier. With that, if you see some changes that you want to push back, don't be afraid to push back to your team, whether it's your client, whether it's your boss. If you got to delay the launch so that critical issues are fixed, do it. I'd say most of the migrations we see are delayed. And the ones where you saw issues with that I showed earlier, those really weren't delayed long enough. So don't be afraid to push back. Migrations are, they're bumpy enough without adding additional issues into the mix. That's why I try to keep it as simple as possible. If I have any say in the matter, because you got a lot going on, right? And here's the thing to keep in mind. If a site is going to launch, regardless of the issues, make sure you inform your higher ups. Make sure you inform the client of fallout. That can be the difference between a client who's really upset with you because, well, you didn't tell me, and a client that's like, hey, you let us know a ball was dropped somewhere, but you mentioned multiple times. So it's really a case of covering yourself and just making sure no one's in for a shock when maybe you lose 20, 25% of your traffic because all your links turn to JavaScript links. So don't be afraid to push back. It can be the difference between something crashing and burning and, the site maintaining an even keel. This one's kind of self-explanatory. Don't launch during a Google update. The reason I add this is because last year of all the updates, I think the majority of my migrations happened to launch on the same day or within days of a Google update. So look, Google's been really great lately at telling us about core updates. So if hey, in August, there's going to be a core update, maybe one, well, it's already August, so it's not going to happen, thankfully. But if one was going to happen and your launch is scheduled in the middle of that, push it back and tell them, don't do it. Google's changing things that may screw us up. You can then blame Google for anything, for your delay. And again, migrations are hard to diagnose the issues with already if something goes wrong. And when you throw a Google update in, it makes it even harder. Well, it's nice to blame Google for our problems, and say, oh, it was definitely them. That's probably not going to cut it. So if they've alerted you to something coming up, just delay the launch, push it back even a week because you want to see kind of how things are moving after that. Avoid phased migrations. So Google does say now that they can handle them, and it's fine. I'm 100% positive that their Google Doc said avoid it, but it's changed now. But we often see phase migration. So the reason that I don't like phase migrations is right there on the slide. It's because of internal or international sites. We talked about it, quickly before, but if one site's moving and the other site's staying the same and content has changed and the links have changed and the href landing tags have not been updated on both sites, it's not going to be good. I can almost guarantee you that you're going to lose rankings. You may see some cannibalization. Things just aren't going to go well. So if you can avoid a phase migration, I do recommend it in general. You can do them. I don't like them. Just be extra careful when you're handling those. All right, I think these are some of the last tips. So start your redirects early, right? You want to test them if possible. And you see, you'd be amazed how rare it is for redirects to actually get tested. A lot of the clients, they just don't do it. I can't tell you why. But what that can lead to is if something's broken, maybe you got an extra space in an HT access. I've done it. And you launch day of, and now something's broken. Well, your redirects aren't firing. So test them early if you can through your staging environment. You'll be able to identify any issues. It's going to save you a lot of problems later on down the line. You'll be able to fix anything. You're probably going to have some mistakes as well. So again, that's why you want to test it. And then be aware of potential better redirect matches down the line. Either a staging site may be updated and better links become available, or some of those old pages may come back. So keep in mind that as things stand today, may not be how they stand a week from now. And if there's a better match coming, you want to go ahead and update those redirects so that you can make sure that that equity is passing. And then triple check your redirects. So check them when the site launches, check later that day or the next day, and then check a week later just to be safe. I mentioned rollbacks for a reason because I've seen them screw up the redirects, and I've seen redirects just disappear because somebody screwed with something and they were gone. So, triple check them, make sure that they're all firing, and you'll thank yourself. All right, I've got a recap here to sum everything on up for you guys with the last few takeaways before we get to Q&A. So remember, most major issues with migrations aren't always the most obvious. There's a lot of good content out there about doing migrations right. But like I said, JavaScript links, content behind accordions, internal linking issues, all that, those can be major issues you may not think of. So keep an eye out for things that aren't obvious. Be aware of what's changing. Don't be afraid to push back. So again, internal linking and content changes aren't always good. Doesn't mean that they can't be good, but usually there can be problems there. And if you feel that there's a problem and you can support it and back yourself up, then don't be afraid to push back. You may save a lot of trouble in the future. Keep the migration as simple and clean as possible, right? Consider saving some changes for after the bulk of the migration goes through. If we did a replatform, great. 2-3 weeks later, then change your content. You're just allowing things to kind of settle, and you're going to be able to better diagnose any issues that come up. And good communication, addressing issues early, prevent major headaches later on. Be friends with your developers. Talk to your project manager. Make sure that all communication lines are open, that you're talking to people so that no balls are dropped later on and something goes wrong. Good communication could be the difference between the migration going well and going very poorly. And with that, it's the Q&A. So I'm going to take a drink now because that's a lot of talking on my end.
Awesome. Thank you. And by the way, while you're getting refreshed before we get into the Q&A, I'd like to pinpoint one of your recommendations was do not update or do not migrate during a Google update. And it feels like we've been under a Google update for the past 3 months between everything that they've been rolling out, right? So crazy times. I think I saw yesterday there was an unconfirmed update, lots of commotion going on between all the tools, and the summer of Google updates. So we'll see how all of this shakes out in the end. We have had a lot of questions come in I'm talking 50 to 60 oriented questions. A lot of them have
Oh, geez.
common themes. Yeah. So if we do not get to your specific question, we are going to follow up with Cody and the team at Conductor to see what they can do on that side. A lot of questions, Cody, have come in about redirects. So
Okay.
first question is, how long would you leave a 301 redirect instruction or command in place after migration? A year or more, or for life?
So I think it was interesting because I think it was last week that Gary,
Yep.
whose last name I can't pronounce, and I'll screw it up if I try, did
Yes.
mention that I don't know. He did say that after a year, he got confirmation that all value passes after a year. And then you can see Patrick Stocks talked about it as well, asking him some questions. I think it's on Twitter. It's well worth reading. Apparently, Google says you can get rid of them after a year. I think they also said, though, for UX reasons to keep them for life. Personally, I'm in the camp of just leave them for as long as possible. Frankly, I kind of distrust Google sometimes with things. So I'm not going to take the risk. I do understand, though, maybe you've got thousands and thousands from, 10 years ago. You can make the call. You're probably fine on that end, but I'm more of a leave them for as long as possible if you can, but at least a year, but as long as possible if you can.
Yeah, I agree. I keep them for as long as possible because you never, first of all, you can always prioritize your redirects by looking at their backlink portfolio or the backlinks shooting to them, right? So like, the ones that people are going to find, if they're on articles, if they're socially bookmarked, things like that, people are probably going to find them. You can also go through, your referrers to see where people are finding you through possibly those redirects. But yeah, that link equity is very important, and it is kind of hard to shut off. And then also there's different phases of redirects, right? So if you're going through a migration right now of site A to site B, there may have been platform changes and other migrations, maybe other domains, other site acquisitions that happened before site A in its current existence. So you're also going to want to go back in time and look for those redirects that are now pointing to site A, which you're going to want to update to point directly to site B. So you don't have all of these redirect hops and chains and loops that you're introducing through a migration as well. So it's not just site A to site B, but it's everything that you've done previously to make sure that you're not going from URL structure 1 to URL structure 2, and then boom, another redirect command to URL structure 3. You can update all those historic redirects to go to the new locations as well, which will, in my experience, speed up that migration, getting that equity over, and maintaining those rankings in Google on the redirect side. We also had a question coming in about, talked a lot about redirects. What about redirects that are left on the site? So not redirects that are picked up by third parties, but for example, if someone decides to say, hey, let's redirect, domain A to domain B, and then there's links to those redirects within like your old blog content, your navigation, should those be updated on the site as well?
Yeah, I would definitely update them. I view it as kind of less of a priority with everything going on. So it can wait till usually after launch. If you're working on something like WordPress, I know you can do a database change a lot of times to quickly push those updates. Funnily enough, that's something I have to mention with a client now, is I got to bring that up to make sure, since that's exactly what's going on, is to update those internal links. So I would do it when you have time, just to get everything updated. And, a redirect adds that little bit of extra loading time. Usually you can't tell, but if you can fix it, you definitely should. But I think it's fine if you have to wait until after the migration launches to do it. And then you can prioritize based on your most important links and like the menu links first, and then go into the old blogs and then fix those.
Great, great. And the good thing about migrations, especially on the enterprise side, is it finally gets you a chance to get all those things fixed that you've wanted to do for years. So Make sure you time all that out as well. The next question that comes through, let's go. Well, this is kind of redirect oriented, and this will be my last redirect question for right now. We had a number of these come in that are very similar. So how should redirects be handled? And you touched upon this a little bit from the SOF 404 perspective. How should redirects be handled for pages or products or locations that are simply not going to exist anymore after the migration? Should you redirect to a 404? Should you leave the pages alone and 404 or 410 them? Would you even recommending utilizing a 302 to go to another page in case a new similar product appears in the future that can then be replaced with that original URL? But any tips on how to handle pages post-migration that are not going to exist anymore? Should you redirect them all to a spot where Google can't find them? Should you 410 or 404 them, 404 them? What are your suggestions on that front?
So what that comes down to me is usually what's going to be best for the user. So if it's a location page and the location's going away, I'm just going to redirect that to the general locations page that has all those locations. Most places should have one. If they don't, I'd probably just redirect it to the home page. I don't know if it's a customer is going to like seeing the 404 for the location or just want to go to the home page. It's kind of a hard one for me to tell off the top. But I would point that to the location page. If it's a product, if the product's super outdated, I'd probably just 410 it, 404 it. If it was a cell phone that's a couple generations old and the product page is gone, you can either I've done this before. I've done this product's no longer being sold. It's kind of a soft 404, but man, it got a lot of traffic still. And so those customers went on to see the newer phone and then would buy that. And so it worked out. But generally products, I point towards either a specific brand or I point to the category page and just leave them there. I think for customers, it can be better that way, especially if there's similar products. If there is no similar product whatsoever, either 410 it if it's never coming back. And it may be nice just before you 410, just to leave a message for the customer saying this product's permanently discontinued. There's some stuff I've looked to buy, and it's kind of disappointing when they don't say that. And so you keep looking and then finally figure out, all right, it's gone. And then, for some ancient pages, I let them 404. If it's a page that's been gone for a couple of years, you're cleaning up old redirects potentially, or this page has nothing to do with us anymore, 404 it, 410 it. I don't even think it needs to go to the home page. The only time I really do that is maybe you have a page, say you have like 30 backlinks, and it seems to be pretty decent from an equity perspective, but the product or whatever it is isn't going to be there. I take the gamble and I point it towards the homepage in the hopes that maybe some of that equity will pass. And maybe it doesn't, but I like to think it will. So it really just depends. Overall, I kind of side with just redirecting to closest matches if possible and only 410ing or 404ing if you need to. I do know, just for an example of a client, I know Puma used to, back in the day, they'd 410 their products when they out of stock, and they had so many good backlinks pointing to things, they just 410 them. And so this is a couple of years ago when I was working with them, but that's a case of maybe it would have been better to redirect that to a category page about those types of shoes, for instance.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. And it does really depend upon the backlink portfolio and everything else, because you could be serving an error message, or you could be kind of sunsetting a page that has amazing backlink equity, right? So what would you rather do? Would you rather take that backlink equity that's already established and point it to something that's relevant as well? Or would you rather sunset and then hire someone to go and get you new backlinks? So I'd rather take advantage of what I already have, right? So that makes a ton of sense. Thank you. I have a question about phased migrations. You had kind of, it looks like based upon this question, the scenario is they're migrating from one domain to the next, but the next domain is already live and it already has articles, maybe a blog on it. Now, would you recommend in this instance to phase something like canonicalling your blogs on site A to their new location on site B first before moving over the transactional component of the site? Or would you rather do it all at once, or does it really depend upon the scenario at the end of the day?
I think it depends on the scenario. I have had that exact situation happen. This was a couple of years ago, though, so things have changed. We did try, and client tried canonically some of the old pages over to the new site, but if I recall, at the end of the day, it didn't really seem to do a whole lot. I don't think it's necessarily wrong to do, but and it's been a couple of years, and things change. So I think it's worth testing on a small set and seeing how it goes, but it really just depends, on what your situation is. I like just redirecting it over because, canonicals aren't absolute. Google may decide to not honor them.
Yep, exactly. Google may ignore canonicals, very finicky there. So the next question that came through, we have a couple left before we time out. So the next question that came through is kind of interesting. If you're migrating, is it best to leave your old sitemap in Google Search Console so the old URLs can be picked up and then redirected to the new ones? Or would you rather take out the old sitemap and just serve Google the new sitemap with the final destination URLs and let Google pick all of that up itself?
So I usually have either the old sitemap or I create a sitemap or have the client create a sitemap with all of the old URLs that are being moved, and I submit that. And the reason is, technically you're breaking all the sitemap rules because, hey, all these pages redirect or maybe some 404. But we found that it does kind of help the process of Google going through the migration, transferring things over. It does seem to speed it up. And for when that, change my address tool with Master Tools or Google Search Console was broken, if you remember that was kind of a workaround that people did. So I do recommend either resubmit your old sitemap or create a new sitemap of all the old URLs. Put that in, and then of course, put your new sitemap in as well.
Yeah, good point. Like the change of address tool is nice to have, but it's not you're gonna have to do a little bit more to kick Google into picking all of that up, right? So that's a great tip on that front. And fantastic. So we're almost out of time, but we saw a lot of questions come in specifically about this. One, how long does it typically take for Google to pick up a domain migration? And then two, how come even a year after the migration, I keep on searching Google for the old domain, site::domain name, and in the Google results, the old domain is popping up, even though it redirects to the new domain. So two-part question, but it had a lot of those come in, if you wouldn't mind.
Perfect. Yeah. So how long does it take? It depends. Our favorite answer. I have found that with bigger sites, it goes way faster. I've seen sites within 1 day seem to transfer over everything. I've also seen sites where it takes probably up to 2, maybe 3 months sometimes to fully move things over. I'd say these days I feel like it's way quicker than it used to be. I expect to see a good portion over by a month, but I've seen such a range of things like that, especially for smaller sites. It seems to take way longer. I don't personally feel that's the most helpful answer right there, but it's what I've seen, so it just depends. But I'd say 1 to 2 months is a good barometer to see kind of where you're at. And then as to, I keep seeing my domain pop up in a site search. Remember, a site search isn't actually equivalent to the index. It's not the exact same. You will find URLs in a site search that Google will not rank. They will not show. Patrick Stocks, I've talked to him a bunch about this, so I can keep refreshing my memory on it. I think he's put out some tweets on it. But if you see it in a site search, that's expected. You're going to see it for a long time. It doesn't mean that Google's still ranking that old URL. Though I will say in cases where brands change and you search the old brand term, you may see that old URL for past a year. I have seen that. And it makes sense from a user experience to me. Google wants you to know that, hey, this is the same, so you go there.
Great. Thank you for clarifying that, because that question comes up quite a bit. And yes, it is natural for those to stay on a site-specific search because it is a user intent at the end of the day, and then they find the new one. So it's good to have. Cody, it's been fantastic. Thank you for going through so much and having a specific, very targeted webinar to share. We had a lot of attendees on today, and like I said, a lot of the questions. So if we did not get to your questions, we're going to be sending all of these over to Cody and to the Conductor team.
Perfect.
We're going to address what we can, and then we'll follow up in our recap on Search Engine Journal, which will include the video from today, and then hopefully the slide deck, and then everything else. Cody and the team of Conductor, it's been a pleasure having you today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's good to talk to you.
You're welcome. So if anyone can see the screen, I don't think this was intended, but we almost do have a cartoon version of your avatar down here for our next webinar, which is the 9 best practices for SMS marketing in 2021, brought to you in partnership with Podium. That's going to be on Wednesday, August 18th, which is next week, I guess, at 2 p.m. Eastern. Same bat time, same bat channel. Cody, it's been a pleasure. Thanks again to all of you. Thanks again for attending, sticking around. We're going to be following up, so check your emails. And thank you to Cody and the team at Conductor. It's been a pleasure hosting you today.